All right, we're zooming. All right, guys. Um, this is a Western Civilization 1 lecture for Wednesday, March 25th, entitled The Great Schism. And basically, The Great Schism, the kind of subtitle that we've put on it, is the splintered church. It's a time when the church is going to split for various reasons, which we will be covering in this lecture. For the time being, until really probably spring break, this looks like the way that we're going to do Western Civ um, with these video lectures on via Zoom. So to kind of get us started, let me pray, and then here we go. Father, I pray for each one of these students that you would just bless them in this time of social distancing. I pray that you would not allow them to isolate and feel lonely, but to use the technology available to make sure they stay connected to each other. Lord, I pray in a time of fear that you would make the church fearless. Teach us to reach out to our neighbors and to figure out how we can help them and love them in the midst of coronavirus. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Oops. So first up, right, we got to kind of recall the background. 100 Years' War, lots of death and yet very little geographical change. They fought 116 years or so, and England got a little slice on the coast of France, right? That's the only geographical change really that happened in the whole war. But the death played a toll on the actual culture itself. Um, and it gave it more of a mindset. We see this reflected on their art. It's a lot more darker. We see it reflected in religion. People are a lot more skeptical of particularly of the church. We see it reflected um, in just the general need and desire for reform, which we'll get to at the end of this lecture. Because asking questions when death's all around, asking questions like "What happens to me after I die?" Is pretty common. 100 Years' War, then you got the Black Death right in the midst of the 100 Years' War. Lots of death. But this time, great economical change, right? And this goes without saying. I mean, look at the coronavirus, guys. Like, not a plague in any sense like the Black Death. Definitely not wiping out 50% of Europe. But look at the economical impact that it's had just in the last week. The 4 years of Donald Trump's administration, in terms of stock market progress and the economy skyrocketing and jobs, has basically been all but erased in the last 4 or so days because of the coronavirus, which is not like the Black Death. It's not killing 50% of the people. So you can kind of just get a feel for how the economy is going to change. Like, certain jobs are just not needed anymore. In the case of the Black Death, right, the workers are few, thus they can demand a little bit more of their bosses, so to speak. So you got the 100 Years' War, the Black Death. These two facts are kind of happening all at the same time as what's called the Avignon. You got to say it like French. The Avignon papacy and the Great Schism. So let's go on to the next slide. So let's talk about the 13th century papacy. So this is the papacy in the 1200s. And we're going to look at basically three popes so you can kind of get a spiritual thermometer of what's going on right before the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, and what's going to lead into this schism in the church. So the first guy up is Pope Innocent III, right? I wrote on our PowerPoint, made the papacy more of a political state. It was now a political power. It's almost like a country itself. So he's going to declare that the Pope alone has authority to declare the saints, to depose people, and then he's going to even kind of create it to where he is essentially like a king, and the papacy is like his monarch, his kingdom, so to speak. And so this is going to naturally weaken the church spiritually, though it's gaining a ton of political power. So it's going to look like it's becoming more powerful from the outside, but in reality, it's the corruption in terms of what the church is supposed to be is going to become apparent toward the end. So Pope Innocent, Urban IV is going to come in light of Innocent, and he's going to make it even further. He's going to take Innocent's principles and he's going to say, you know what? I will establish a law court specific to the Roman Catholic Church. It's called the Rota Romana. And all matters of law and debate for Roman Catholic citizens would be taken before in this church, thus almost setting up, again, this feel like it's its own kind of country, right? And so that's kind of the trajectory of it. Toward the end of the 13th century, so 1294, the cardinals get into a conclave and they vote. They're voting on a pope, right? They're trying to figure out, well, you know, who are we voting on here? And it's 2 years of deadlock. They can't decide. No one, they're so corrupt, or they have different decisions that they can't decide. So there's 2 years deadlock. And so finally they choose a guy, an inept hermit, and they choose him as pope, a godly inept hermit. Now, the reason we say inept is we mean this is a godly man, but he's not ready to run a country, and that's basically what Roman Catholicism is at this point. It's like a country. So he's godly. He's got all the things that you would want in a spiritual person, a spiritual leader, but he doesn't have the capacity to run a country, which is what the Roman Catholic Church needs at this point. And so he becomes Celestine V, and within 2 weeks of his rule, he abdicates the papacy. So he leaves it. We have no clue why. It's very suspicious, right? And then a few days later, right, he's found dead. So this guy likely was eliminated, for political reasons. And so Boniface, Pope Boniface, is going to come and become the new pope in Celestine's place. And that's where we're going to look at, and that's where the Avignon papacy will begin-ish. So look at this, the Avignon captivity. So what we have here is a continuation of our king versus pope themes. And, you know, we've seen this throughout history. All since Constantine, there's this constant question of, how does the state relate to the church? Is the state over the church? Is the church over the state? Are they together? Do we blend their laws? Do we separate their laws? How does this work? And then in the Middle Ages, it gets even further aggravated by popes and kings kind of asserting authority over one another and even killing each other or forcefully arresting each other, etc., etc. This is another example. Boniface and Philip, the king of France, are kind of the next example of king versus pope. And so Boniface is going to issue a papal bull, right? This is an order. It's kind of like an executive order if a president was issuing it. It's an executive order, but for popes. And let me look up the name here. The papal bull was called the Clericis Laicos. And what it basically did was it said, no kings can tax Roman Catholics without the Pope's permission. So if you're an English citizen or a French citizen under your king, you are not allowed to be taxed by the king unless the Pope gave them authority to do that. And so you can kind of see how the state and the church is getting a little boop, like this. What ends up happening is different countries react differently. England, King Edward I, is going to essentially say, okay, you can do that, but none of the citizens who are Roman Catholics in England will have my protection. You will not be allowed to appeal to the courts, and I won't protect you. That's kind of devastating, but not too bad. Philip the Fair is going to take it a step further. He's going to say that, but then he's also going to say, you know what? I ain't going to send any money from France to Rome. Now, it didn't take Boniface long to realize that this would bankrupt Rome, bankrupt thus the Roman Catholic Church, and so he removes his papal bull. So Philip 1, Boniface 0. So Boniface is later on he's going to put out 2 more papal bulls. One of them is called, in Latin, let me read the Latin. Scrolling through my notes. Anyways, basically it says, listen, my son. That's what the papal bull is entitled. Ascolta fili, listen, my son, where he basically, I quote, says this to Philip: God has set popes over kings and kingdoms. And then he, in 1302, a little while later, a couple months later, went from 1301 to 1302, a couple months later, he puts another papal bull off called the Unam Sanctum, which basically says that temporal authority is subject to eternal authority, aka the government is subject to the church. Now, Philip reacts pretty pragmatically here. He denounces the Pope, Boniface. He raises an army. He tells the French that Boniface is just a criminal and a heretic, and then he captures Boniface, beats him, and then is about to execute him, but another population of Rome saves him. He gets back to Rome. He dies of his wounds not long after. And then Philip, under the pretense of legally electing a pope, puts in his own pope, Clement V. And beyond that, he moves the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France. Avignon, is a city in France. And so now the papacy is no longer in Rome. And this it scandalizes the church, right? And we'll see that a little bit later. So in Avignon, there's a set of popes. There's still this tension, Pope versus King. The probably most famously would be Pope John the 22nd from 1316 to 1334. He basically, after Philip is dead, right, and a new king gets elected, I think it's Louis IV, he refuses to even acknowledge him as king. But he's in Avignon, France. So you can still see this tension. But what happens during this time period is a few people start writing in defense of the secular government's own authority. Christians are writing this. So let's explain what that means. William Ockham and Marsilius of Padua wrote tracts that defended royal authority as being separate from the church, meaning that they have authority and it's separate from the church. Marsilius's Defender, his tract Defender of the Peace, basically taught two things, that the autonomy and origins of secular government is independent of the church. And then the second thing he did was he tried to separate divine law from secular law, meaning, if you break the speed limit, the church can't punish you, the king can. If you if you say you lie to someone. Well, if that's not a law in the land that's broken, it's a law in the church that's broken. The church can punish you in the sense of they can excommunicate you or they can discipline you or whatever, but they can't you shouldn't be executing people for being heretics. So we could think of Joan of Arc, right? Who's executed as a relapsed heretic. They're trying to separate that, and the church shouldn't have that kind of power to do those things. Now it gets a little messy because, for instance, most lands would say don't murder someone. Well, that's also technically divine law, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not murder. Now, also on the scene, John Wycliffe and Jean Hus come, and these guys basically hold to a lot of the Reformation teachings of the Protestant church, only in the 1400s, before there's a Reformation. And so a lot of times these guys are looked at as actually the ones that are spurring on what Martin Luther and John Calvin and Ulrich Zwingli are doing, right? And they're going to come on the scene. We'll talk about them at a later date. So moving on from this slide to the next. The Great Schism. So what is it, right? We've already got the scandalousness of the Avignon papacy. So what happens is in Pope Gregory XI in 1377 is going to move the papacy back from Avignon to France, to Rome, where it belongs. Gregory dies, and Pope Urban VI is elected pope in Rome. However, there's some cardinals who are kind of upset that that's the way that this went down. They basically feel essentially that Urban was Roman. He's from Rome. He's from Italy. And that's the only reason he got elected, was to once again just kind of show that, oh, we're back to Rome and this whole Avignon thing was really bad, et cetera, et cetera. So on September 20th, 1378, a little after Gregory is elected, 13 cardinals gather for their own vote, their own conclave to select a pope. Now, all but one of these cardinals were French, so no bias. That was a joke. There's a lot of bias. And they vote on a guy, and they give him the title Clement the Seventh. This guy was the cousin to the current French king. Again, no bias. And they put him in as pope. Now, Urban's the Pope, so how does this guy? So Clement is going to be the Pope, and he moves to Avignon, France. Urban is the Pope, and he's in Rome. And so now you have two popes, but only one church, a two-headed monster. And so if the Avignon papacy was called the Babylonian captivity, it was compared to Israel being taken captive in Babylon. That's how bad it scandalized the church. What is it going to be? This would essentially be like when Israel split, right? Rehoboam gives the pinky speech, pinky, and Judah, the the southern kingdom, and Israel, the northern kingdom, split, and then the rest of the Old Testament, from basically most of the book of Kings, right, and Chronicles, yeah, the kingdom is split into two. So this is like that, right? So the church is now split. So how are they gonna fix this? Insert conciliar movement. The conciliar movement was a time when councils established even by secular governments or kings have authority equal to or higher than the Pope. And this drastically changes the way the church thinks. First, I mean, it gives the implicit understanding that if your leader is not looking out for your well-being, aka he's not being a good leader, you don't have to listen to him. His authority is moot, and you can kind of establish your own authority route via group, right? A council coming together and establishing authority. It also gave power back more so to the kings. So the king versus pope thing is now favoring the kings drastically more. And so the conciliar movement is going to attempt to solve this great schism, this split, this two-headed monster. And the way that they're going to do it is through councils. Well, the first council fails, and the second council is successful-ish. So let's look at that. Pisa and Constance. So the first council was in 1409, the Council of Pisa. And what they're going to do is they're deposing both popes who don't recognize their authority. So they're deposing them. They're saying, you're not the pope anymore, even though they didn't care what they said. And then they appointed another pope, Alexander V. Problem. Well, Xander Goodwin walks into my class and says, Mr. Miller, I depose you. You are no longer the teacher. I am now the teacher. Right? And let's say a few of you guys agree with him. Well, I walk up and I'm just like, well, Xander, I don't recognize your authority as being that of the caliber to remove me from my teaching duty and put yourself into it. And so I just kind of ignore you. Or maybe I'm concerned and I go to Mr. Lemon and he assures me from the executive team that you have no authority to remove me as teacher. That's kind of what happens here. The popes don't care. They're not listening, and there's no reason for them to listen. So what ends up happening is you have an Avignon pope, a Rome pope, and now a third pope, Alexander V. So it's now a three-headed monster. And there is no Old Testament equivalent to compare it to because the kingdom didn't split into three parts. It only split into two. So the Council of Constance, learning from Pisa, 5 years later, in 1414, they recognize, first of all, they go in being recognized by two of the three popes. So they have approval from two of the three popes. And they waited to instill what they declare from this council. They wait until all three popes are either A, stepping down of their own volition, or dead, right? And so they wait, and then they elect Martin V as pope. And so now the church is finally back to having only one pope, but the damage has been done. And so the constant fighting, no pun intended, the constant fighting of the pope and king and the moving of the papacy from Rome to Avignon, back to Rome, and finally the electing of the popes at the same time. At one point in time, we have three popes elected. Three-pointer. This led the Roman Catholic Church to being mistrusted by most of the citizens, right? I mean, and more than that, right? The bishops, the archbishops, the priests, the deacons, whatever it is, the different clergymen of the church, even they themselves, when they're analyzing the Roman Catholic Church, they see a need for reformation within the church. And this is going to start to spur us toward what we're going to see in the 1500s with Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the door of Wittenberg Church. It's the Facebook of its time. And you can clearly see a reformation's needed. The church even agrees. The church is going to try to reform itself. And so that's kind of what the Great Schism led to, combined with the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, and this conciliar movement reconciling it, the need for reform. So that's it for today, but I just want to give you a quick, just kind of update. So we're going to do this lecture format until at least Easter break. I'll upload the lectures on the days of to YouTube, and then I'll put the link in your lesson plans. You can watch on your smartphone or watch on your computer or whatever. And I'm going to try to keep them relatively around 30 minutes to 40 minutes, but they're definitely not going to be 55 minutes like they normally are. The assignments are going to remain the same, 2 a week, right? Your Tuesdays and your Thursdays. And likely the Thursday will continue, I'll give you time to do your research paper. So you're only going to have like one history assignment. And that'll all be normal. But what I would ask you all to do is, if you could, when you're doing your written assignments for me, put it into a Google Doc. So just go ahead and type it into a Google Doc and share that with me. So how I'm grading these assignments is I'm looking for intent, I'm looking for content, and I'm just basically saying, did this person do what I asked them to do? And it's going to, if you did what I asked you to do, you're likely going to get 100 for the time being. If there are serious lack of effort and lack of content, and clearly you didn't do what I asked you to do, I'll mark you off a little bit. But if it's a Google Doc, I would like to just type my notes into it, and then you can kind of have it, so I don't have to go to the school, print it, mark it up, and then somehow scan it and then send it to you. That's just so much in between. So just Google Docs for now. If you cannot figure out how to do Google Docs, that's fine. Just take a picture and send it to me via email or text message. Tests and quizzes, as of now, will only count as home assignment grades. So do not freak out if we have a test and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're doing a test during coronavirus. What I'm asking you to do is don't cheat on it. Do the same thing that you normally do, study for it, and do your best on it. It's only going to count as an at-home assignment. I just need these assessments to let me know how you're receiving the lectures in this format. Do I need to slow down? Do I need to speed up? Or is this just right, Goldilocks style, right? And so that's what I would ask of you guys in regards to Western Civ. And at any point, if you have a question, right? If you have a question of, any kind of question where, what do I do? I don't understand this, or like he's one of our tests, right? And you're like, I don't understand this question. Same kind of thing. We can email, text, whatever. And if enough people have the same question, we'll just set up some kind of Zoom time where we can all get on and talk to each other or whatever. That's the idea here. All right, let me stop this video.